Just to reiterate what Gary was saying, we're going to try to keep the Q&A till the end of the presentation, but I will be monitoring it. So we certainly are going to try to get to all of your questions. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Beckham. She's a professor here at UT San Antonio, and she teaches courses on entomology and zoology as well. Her research focuses on our Texas native bumblebees, which I'm really excited to learn a lot more about. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Beckham. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited. I haven't given a talk on just bumblebees in a while, so I'm excited to talk about my favorites. So I'm going to share my screen and just make sure that that shows up for everyone. Real quick, so it should be, oops, not, sorry, bear with me for just a second. Okay, so does that show up as my full screen? Are you seeing my PowerPoint, Amanda?
Yes, I am.
Is it the full screen, or does it look like?
No, it doesn't look like full screen.
It's the presenter's view with the.
It's the presenter's view. Okay.
Slide.
Let me swap and see. Does that look right?
That's good.
Okay, nice. So here we go. So all right, and let me do one more thing, which is make sure that you're gonna have my sound too. Okay, so here we go. So yes, I am at UTSA. My background is broadly in studying bees and bumblebees in particular. And that's what I'm really excited to talk about tonight, specifically the bumblebees of Texas. But before we get into just bumblebees in general, y'all are all very smart master naturalists, so you already know this, but I just want to reiterate that pollinators are just super important creatures in the ecosystems of our planet, in particular our terrestrial ecosystems. They're considered keystone species, which means that without them, ecosystems could collapse. And there's a lot of different types of pollinators. Of course, you know about hummingbirds, and certain bats are going to be pollinators, but insects are the primary pollinators of most flowering plants. Research has shown that approximately 80% of wild flowering plants are pollinated by insects. And then also a lot of our agricultural and cultivated flowering plants are pollinated by insects. And that includes your butterflies, a lot of people are surprised to know that flies can be really good pollinators. A lot of beetles are pollinators. But of course, tonight we're talking about bumblebees, who I argue are some of the very best of our pollinators. There's a lot of reasons that they're awesome pollinators. One of the things is that they are considered generalists. They're not going to go to just one type of flowering plant. They tend to frequent many different types of flowering plants, just kind of whatever's available. Although they do kind of prefer bigger blooms. I'm not talking giant blooms per se, but just a little bigger, because there are large, robust insects, and tiny flowers are more difficult for them to deal with. Another reason why they're awesome is because of those large, robust bodies, which are covered with dense seta or hairs. And those hairs pick up a lot of pollen as the bumblebee gets into the flower and roots around in there for pollen and nectar. They're really messy, and that hair just attracts the pollen. And so as the bumblebees go from flower to flower, they're then going to inadvertently carry a lot of pollen. So that makes them a good pollinator as well. The numbers of bumblebees tend to be more than a lot of other bees on the planet. And so just the density of bumblebees in an ecosystem is going to be higher, because bumblebees, unlike most bees on the planet, are hive bearing bees, or they're social bees. Most bees on the planet are solitary bees, but those social bees tend to just have a higher density ecosystems. And then one other thing that's really cool about bumblebees, and not just bumblebees, a lot of our native bees are able to do this, but buzz pollination is one of the ways that they're able to pollinate. And there are a number of plants which require buzz pollination in order to be effectively pollinated. And I point this out because the honeybee, which is the bee that most people know about, does not buzz pollinate. And so what am I talking about? What's buzz pollination? Well, this is going to be specifically for plants which have horizontally dehiscent anthers. So basically they're like little anthers that are shaped like salt shakers. And in order for the pollen to be dislodged, they have to kind of be buzzed or shaken, and then the pollen will be released. And so the way that our bumblebees will buzz pollinate is by grabbing onto those anthers and then vibrating their wing muscles. And then in effect, they sonically release the pollen from those anthers. It's been said that that buzz is right at a middle C. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but you know, it's at this particular frequency that dislodges the pollen. So that is one other thing. And I should mention some of the examples of plants that require buzz pollination are those like tomatoes, blueberries, cranberries. So a number of our plants that are important to humans will require buzz pollination. And I have a couple of quick videos, and so hopefully you can hear this well so that you can actually see and hear the buzz pollination in action. This is a bumblebee buzzing a tomato flower.
Still on 30, still on 24.
So that sound right there, if you could hear it, was the buzz pollinating. It's really a little high-pitched buzz. And then this is one that I actually observed myself in Hardburger. So this is where I see them buzz pollinating a lot on these, I believe it's called a nightshade, a silverleaf nightshade. I'm really bad with plants, so we'll see. But I think it's a silverleaf nightshade. You might be able to hear this one too. So you can really see her shaking those anthers as she's vibrating her wing muscles. And then basically that pollen, just I'm pointing at my screen here, the pollen, sorry, the pollen is going to be released, and then she packs it here in her cuticula. All right, so that is buzz pollination. Like I said, they're just awesome pollinators. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about their life cycle, because I think it's super interesting. And it also is important to kind of have an awareness of it for the purpose of conserving them, because being aware of all of the habitat requirements will help you to be a good bumblebee conservator. So a bumblebee lives in a hive, just like a honeybee does. But unlike the honeybee, the bumblebee's hive cycle is just going to last for 1 year. So you might be aware that honeybee hives can last for multiple years. They'll overwinter, basically because they're able to store up honey, and then they use that honey as a food source during the winter months when there aren't flowers available. Bumblebees don't do that. They kind of start the hive in the beginning of the growing season, and then it dies out by the winter time. And so I'm going to start with the springtime, which is like right now. So what you'll be seeing right now is the emergence of mated queens who have been overwintering in kind of a dormant state. And around here, obviously it depends on the weather. If you have a polar vortex, everything's going to be shifted just a bit. But you know, around March, typically these mated queens will emerge from their overwintering site. And the queen will actually procure a nest site and build her first wax cells. And so that's also different from the honeybee hive. The honeybee queen never does any work except laying eggs. The bumblebee hive is initiated by the work of the queen. So she finds the nest site, builds her nest, and then begins laying eggs. At that point, she's the only one who is an adult, obviously, because she just has eggs. So she's also going to be foraging. So right about now, if you go out and see a bumblebee, odds are that you are seeing a queen bumblebee, and they're very large. I was out at Hartberger Park last week, and I saw my very first bumblebee of the season. So I was super excited to see that. But they're really large and kind of bumbling around. You can see why they're called bumblebees by the way the queens fly. So she's going to forage, feed her eggs and her larvae, really feed her larvae the pollen that she forages for. She's going to try and keep them warm on cool days, etc. And finally, after about 6 weeks, her first brood will be emerging as adults. And over the course of the next couple months, her hive is going to grow in number, and she will take over just the duties of laying eggs. Meanwhile, her workers, which will be emerging, will start to do all the foraging and building of new cells, etc. So here in April to August, approximately, we're seeing workers being produced. And in a bumblebee hive, just like with a honeybee hive, workers are all female and they are sterile for the most part. And so then they grow in a number. Potentially, a really healthy bumblebee hive might get to about 500 individuals. That would be a really healthy hive. If the hive gets large enough and is healthy enough, then here in about late July, early August, the queen is going to switch from making new workers to making new reproductives. So what that means is she'll start making males as well as new queens. And she's never going to switch back to making workers. So as they rear out these new queens and males, the workers are the last workers, and ultimately they'll start to perish, and the hive will diminish in size over the course of the next month or two. Meanwhile, those new reproductives are going to leave the hive, leave their parent hive, they'll mate, males die. Just like in many insect species, the male is only for reproductive purposes. So he mates and dies. The females then who have mated will sort of eat a bunch of stuff, like try and bulk up their fat stores. And then ultimately, as the weather cools, they'll find an overwintering site. And then the old hive, as the workers die out, will also just die. So that's why it's just a 1 year cycle. And then the overwintering queen, she's going to be dormant over the winter, and then the cycle starts again in the next year. So giving you approximate dates or approximate months, that goes for South Texas. This will be different depending on where you are in the world, of course, but this is about what you see down here in South Texas. So with all that being said, keep in mind, as we talk about bumblebees, that they really require 3 types of habitat, depending on what time of the year it is. They need a nest site, which tends to be underground or in a thatchy prairie grass. However, I've got this picture here, which is of a bumblebee hive in a bird box. That happens. They like soft insulated areas, so they can even go into a wall. I had a professor back in Denton who had a bumblebee hive in an old mattress that was in the back of his in his backyard. So it just depends on what they can find. They will opportunistically find a site to nest. They need foraging sites as long as they are living. So basically from late February, early March, all the way to October, sometimes November. They need flowers available, and then an overwintering site for the queen, which can be mulch, or here's an example of a queen bumblebee which had found a flower pot to overwinter in. they like that kind of just like a little swale or mulch that they'll stay in overnight. So that's all that the bumblebees need. We need all of those sites in order to persist. How do you know if you're actually looking at a bumblebee? Because actually there are a lot of bees, or a lot of insects that look like bumblebees. This is a bumblebee right here. Meanwhile, this looks a lot like a bumblebee, but it's a mimic, which is a robber fly. Carpenter bees are often mistaken for bumblebees because they're about the same size. And then here is your European honeybee, the back view, but that's our honeybee, which is a bit smaller. So I'm going to show you some kind of relative or some pictures to compare the two, compare these to each other. So here we've got a bumblebee. This is not a species we have in Texas, but I just like the picture because it was a good one. Bumblebee versus honeybee here. You can see bumblebees are a bit plumper and furrier than our honeybee. Honeybees are always going to kind of come in this coloration, although the abdomen can be a little darker or lighter depending on the strain of honeybee. But not so much hair on the abdomen, more hair on the thorax and the face, and a bit smaller typically. That is honeybee versus bumblebee. Here is a carpenter bee versus a bumblebee. I always tell people to remember carpenter bees have shiny heinies. They're very, very metallic looking, very little hair on the abdomen versus a bumblebee will have lots of fur on that abdomen. However, they are approximately the same size and really have similar flying patterns as well. But I feel like that really shiny abdomen is a good tell that you're looking at a carpenter bee, not a bumblebee. And this here is an eastern carpenter bee, one of our common ones. There are a number of flies that mimic bees and bumblebees specifically. And so here's a few traits to look at when you're trying to discern whether you're looking at a bee versus a fly. And by the way, here's a bumblebee on top. Here is a robber fly on the bottom. So one of the things to look at is the face. Top is a bee, a bumblebee, and then on the bottom is just a fly. There's lots of different types of flies, of course, but when you look at your bumblebee or bee in general, the eyes, they're large, but they tend to be kind of on the side of the face. With flies, a lot of times those eyes are going to be very large and bulging, and then will meet or almost meet, this one's not actually meeting, but will almost meet at the top of the head. So the eyes are much larger on your fly. Another thing is that the fly antennae tend to be much smaller. So here you can see the bee antennae, pretty long. In this case, they're kind of elbowed. The fly antennae are really short there in the middle of the head. And then we see, if you look closely at the wings, which is kind of hard to do when they're in flight, but if you're able to look closely at the wings, you'll note that bees have 4 true wings. And so here's the forewing on this one, and the hind wing, and then forewing, hind wing. In flight, the fore and hind wings are going to actually be kind of hooked together on bees. So it's a little difficult to tell whether you're looking at 2 or 4 wings, but it's really easy to tell on a fly that you're looking at just 2 wings, because on all flies, the back wings are modified into these structures called halteres, which are sort of like rudder-like structures that help them to be more aerodynamic when they're flying. I chose a crane fly on this picture just because the halteres are so exaggerated, but these are going to be similar on all flies. They'll be these kind of little stick-like features. And then finally, if you see something that is deliberately carrying pollen, you know that it is a bee because flies don't deliberately carry pollen around on their legs. They're not packing it into any structures on their body. So those are just some ways, some tips to tell the difference between the two. Wasps and bees can be more difficult to tell, although I can't think of a wasp that looks really like a bumblebee, except possibly a yellow jacket, because the yellow and black markings are pretty similar. But the yellow jacket does not have much fur at all. So you're not going to mistake that for a bumblebee. You might mistake it for another type of bee, but that is definitely not a bumblebee. Generally speaking, wasps tend to be a bit thinner and less hairy. Not always, though. So I don't have a really good way to tell you how to discern wasps from bees unless you're looking really carefully with a microscope, or just you've been exposed to these more. They're just really close cousins in the same order there. So now we're going to test you. I wish I could see all of y'all and see your thumbs up or your hands being raised, but I'm just going to let you participate from home on your own. So I'm going to test you to see if it's a bumblebee. So here is your first one. Take a look. Do you think this is a bumblebee or not? Remember to look at the features that I told you about. So hopefully you have your answer in your mind. If you said, no, it's not a bumblebee, then you are correct. This is a fly, a little bee fly. You can see those large eyes, really short antennae. Common little fly around here. How about this one? Is that a bumblebee or is it not? Give you a second to think about it. And so if you are saying, no, not a bumblebee, you're right. This is one of those robber flies. And this one I feel like is so tricky because look at that. It's even evolved these little yellow hairs on its mid legs, not its hind legs, but on the mid legs to mimic the corbicula, the pollen carrying structures of the bumblebee. But you can see the really big eyes, tiny antennae, and yeah, not a bumblebee. What about this one? Is that a bumblebee? That one's probably pretty easy for y'all. It is not. No fur. It's a syrphid fly. Little short antennae, big eyes that meet there in the middle. And if you look really carefully right there, you can see the halt here on that side. I can't see it on the other side. How about this one? Bumblebee? Not. I know y'all are all saying, no way, that is a honeybee. I know, and you would be correct if you're saying that's a honeybee, not a bumblebee. And then this one, what do you think? So this one's a little tougher sometimes, but if you remember that shiny honey, that's a carpenter bee. It's a type of bee, but a carpenter bee. Not a bumblebee. And there's your bumblebee, of course. Now, I'm going to show you one more picture. This one's tricky. So there's two insects here. And what you're actually seeing is a robber fly eating a bumblebee. So the reason why robber flies look just like bumblebees often is because they are predators of bumblebees. So they'll ambush bumblebees, eat them, etc. But they look like that in order to kind of fit in among the bumblebees. And you'll find robber flies where bumblebees would forage. They kind of sit on the flowers, but then you hear them go zit, and they're going for bumblebees. All right, so let's look at Texas bumblebees. We have a few species of bumblebees in Texas, not near as many as other states. And so it's actually pretty easy to become an expert identifier of bumblebees in Texas. And I should also mention that in San Antonio, there's really only 2 common species and potentially one more. So you might, if you want to ID bumblebees in San Antonio, you really just need to learn 3 bees. But then in Texas, there are a few more common ones. And so this is, I've put boxes around the most common ones. You got Bombus griciacolus. Bombus is the genus for all bumblebees. So Bombus griciacolus, Bombus impatiens, and then Fraternist, sonorous, and Pennsylvanicus. And these three over here are the ones that you might potentially see here in San Antonio, but really these two are the most common around here. So let's see what these look like. Oh, and so this is giving you, these are some figures that I created for a paper that I did a couple years back, or a few years back now, looking at the distribution of bumblebees in Texas. And, you know, it's just a heat map. The brighter reds and oranges are where you would expect to see that species more. And then the blues are where you would not expect to see it. So Bombus Fraternist is mainly up in Northeast Texas, although, like I said, there might be some down here. I know there's definitely some in the hill country, confirmed sightings, so it wouldn't be such a far stretch to see them here. Garcia is the brown belted. That's more East Texas. You don't see them so often down here. Same thing with Impatiens, further east, Houston area, and then East Texas. It's more of an Eastern United States bumblebee. But Pennsylvanicus and sonorous are the two that are most common in the state and also most common here in San Antonio. And there's some disagreement as to whether Pennsylvanicus and sonorous should be lumped or split. I say they should be split based on research that I've done. They still need to put out there, but a lot of scientists think they should just be Pennsylvanicus, so I lumped them here. But just so you can see, here's some information about where those are distributed based on some field work I did. So the blues are all the Pennsylvanicus, the yellows are sonorous, and then the greens are sites where we found both at the same spot. And like I said, San Antonio is a prime area of sympatry where you see both in pretty equal numbers, to be honest. So how do you know what they are? I'm going to show you some key morphological characteristics to look out for. Really, for the females, it's looking at the black and yellow banding patterns on the bumblebees. And because they are so big and they tend to light on flowers and just kind of root around, it's kind of easy to get a good look at them. I say easy. It's easier to get a good look at these than it is certain other insects. So with Pennsylvanicus, what you'll find on the thorax, which is that middle body part of an insect, is a bright yellow band followed by all black. And then on the abdomen, there's a little bit of black on the first tergite and then a little yellow. And then the following two bands are going to be yellow followed by all black. So it's yellow and then black on that abdomen. You can kind of see it here too, yellow and then all black at the tip. But that yellow to black thorax is how you will distinguish it from the sonorous, which is closely related. So I'll show you that in a second. The males do look quite different from the females though. They oftentimes get reports of the, what do they call it? Maybe the black and gold bumblebee, which has a much yellower abdomen, but really this is just a male Pennsylvanicus. They're brighter, their abdomen will be all yellow and sometimes even have a bright orange tip to it. They're really pretty and flashy, but that's just a male. So you'll start to see those in July, August. I say just a male, it's a male, just as important as the The sonorous then, like I said, this is the other one that you see around here. If you look at the thorax, you get a yellow, black, yellow, almost like a cat eye or something. Remember, the Pennsylvanicus would just be yellow, then black. Meanwhile, the sonorous is yellow, black, yellow. And then you've got the bands of yellow that are pretty similar on the abdomen. And then here are some actual specimens of sonorous. A lot of times people are like, what's the difference between a queen and a worker? Really, it's just size when it comes to bumblebees. This is a queen, and then here's a worker, and you can see this one is much larger. Her abdomen's much larger to accommodate those eggs she's going to be laying and whatnot. So that's Pennsylvanicus and sonorous. So if you can get those down, you are well on your way to having a high level of expertise for our San Antonio bumbles. So which is which here? This is one of these is Pennsylvanicus and one is sonorous. So take a look. And if you're saying that this one, 37, on your left is Pennsylvanicus, you would be right because you can see the yellow and then all black on the thorax. Meanwhile, sonorous again has that yellow, black, yellow coloration to it. All right, so next I'm just gonna look at the others that you might see in Texas. The next Fraternus is also known as the Southern Plains Bumblebee. And the banding pattern is kind of similar to is kind of similar to sonorous, and that you have a yellow, black, yellow. But if you look at the hair on your Fraternus, it's like it's had a buzz cut. No pun intended there, but it's like very short hair, very neatly combed, versus the sonorous is going to have a little bit be fuzzier, longer hairs. Also, we're just looking at the top two tergite and then all black. The abdomen tends to be a bit longer and narrower on Fraternus too. And as I mentioned, this one is not going to be near as common down here. Actually, there's been no sightings that I know of this one in San Antonio, but I just mention it because, like I said, they have found them in the hill country, which isn't too far from here. Then impatient, I'll show you Impatiens and Garcia as well, although these are more eastern species. Impatiens is a common eastern bumblebee. As I mentioned, these are further east and all on the eastern portion of the United States. But we get a all yellow thorax with a little black dot in the middle. All of this is fuzzy though, and then one band of yellow on the abdomen. These also have really, really fuzzy hair, so they look like they've got shaggy hair as compared to Fraternus, which would be really short hair. And then Impatiens is very similar to our final one that I wanted to mention, which is Garcia. So we still have that kind of yellow thorax with a black dot in the middle. And then there is a yellow band, just like with Impatiens. And under that is another band of varying color. Oftentimes, it's kind of a brownish color, like what you're seeing on this bee here. Hence the common name brown-belted bumblebee. But it can also be kind of yellowish, which makes it really confusing and can be a little difficult to tell from Impatiens. So those are your 5 most common bumblebee species in the state. There have been a few sightings of a few other species, but they're so rare that I feel like if you focus on these 5, you are going to be you're going to be great for Texas bumblebees. All right, so unfortunately, bumblebees are declining everywhere you find bumblebees. So worldwide, bumblebees are declining. And it's, in fact, in the United States, a couple years back, they listed a Bombus Fraternist, which is the rusty patch bumblebee, as an endangered species. And it's not found down here in Texas, it's up in the kind of Great Lakes region. But just having that bumblebee on the endangered species list has brought more attention to bumblebees in general. Anyhow, in Texas, we've got 3 species that the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has designated as species of greatest conservation need. So basically what that means is that these are species which are imperiled, at least in part of their range. And those include our 2 most common, Pennsylvanicus and sonorous. And you're probably like, whoa, why are those considered important conservation species? They're doing fine here in Texas. Yeah, but in these 2 species, the Pennsylvanicus is found kind of from the Rocky Mountains east, and then sonorous is found from the Rockies west, and generally, I should say. And across their ranges, they're considered to be declining. So whereas they're doing pretty well here in our state, in other parts of the country where they're trying to survey for them, they're not finding them, or they're finding them in much lower densities than what would be expected based on historic numbers. So I always tell people this is really cool for Texas because it means we have the opportunity to do something really great for these imperiled species that, for whatever reason, are still doing okay here in our state. Probably because we have so much private land that's rangeland. It's probably contributing to their status of still being able to do okay. But anyways, Pennsylvanicus and sonoris, definitely an opportunity to help and conserve them. Variabilis, then, it's a very rare species. I've personally never observed it. And I can't even remember the last sighting that was in Texas. It's probably locally extinct. But if we were to see it, I mean, it's definitely something to think about and conserve. But it's a cuckoo bee, which parasitizes Pennsylvanicus nests. Anyhow, so those declines are worrisome, and there's a lot of reasons for those declines that are probably all working synergistically to lead to these. Of course, just like all these endangered species and imperiled species on the planet across taxa, habitat loss is one of the major driving forces. In fact, habitat loss is considered the top reason for bumblebee declines. And I'm just going to play this. This is a time lapse of the way that San Antonio metro area has changed since 1984. You can just watch as the city grows. But if you think about all of those habitat requirements for bumblebees, we need the foraging sites, the nest sites, and the overwintering sites. If you cover the ground with concrete, you're going to be removing those habitats. So as we grow our cities larger, we are in effect often removing the important bumblebee habitat. And that doesn't just go for Texas. That's worldwide, the leading cause of bumblebee declines. Agricultural intensification is another cause. And when I say this, it's basically where we're switching from growing many crops or having native prairies to these vast monocultures, because a monoculture tends to starve out bees in the times of year where that one crop, or when that one crop isn't growing. So if you have got one crop, it's going to flower for a few weeks, and then there's nothing else the rest of the year. And as I mentioned earlier, bumblebees are going to be active for a long time during the year, and they need flowers that entire time. And here's just some data showing the trend in the United States towards less and less diverse cropland, where we're growing fewer and fewer crop species in many areas. So that, again, not just in the United States, this is in many parts of the world where we're switching to these monocultures. Right in line with that are pesticides. So agricultural practices in general, pesticides are not just going to be negative for pests. They are also going to kill beneficial insects. Most of these are just broadcast pesticides. And the most research that has been done recently has been on these two classes of pesticides, the neonicotinoids and pyrethroids, which are some of the most widely used classes of pesticides in agriculture, and actually by just private citizens too, like not agriculture, agricultural people. So what we find with this research, which just there has just been a vast amount of research done over the past decade. What we're seeing is that for bumblebees in particular, the application of these pesticides will decrease the foraging rates, survival rates, food consumption of the workers, and all of that together ends up causing frequent hive failure, meaning that the hive itself will collapse because the workers just are not performing as they should. And these are not just problematic for bees, it's also been linked to bird declines and other animal declines. So just working its way up throughout the ecosystem. And this particular paper that I'm referring to was done in the Netherlands, where they linked it to songbird declines in the Netherlands. But then there's other interesting research that shows that bees may prefer foods containing neonicotinoids. So if you look at that word, it's in the middle of it, it has almost nicotine. And it is like an analog to nicotine. So they prefer that. It's kind of like a drug to them. If they're given sugar water that is not laced with neonicotinoids and some that is laced, they will go to the neonicotinoid laced sugar water. And then I just saw this paper recently, although it's a couple years old now, but they found that bumblebees treated with neonicotinoids fly faster too, but can't fly as long. So again, just like nicotine affects us, it kind of revs them up, but then they cannot perform as long. So not only is it all of these kind of bad effects to the hive in general, but these sublethal effects as well. Maybe the worst thing about neonicotinoids for bees is that a lot of them are applied as systemic pesticides, meaning that they are applied as a coating to the seeds. And then as the seeds grow, those pesticides persist in the plant tissue, which includes the pollen, or I should say in all of the plant parts, including the pollen and the nectar. And so as bees forage and pick up the pollen and nectar, they're going to be picking up those pesticides. So it's not just like a spray, it's actually persisting in the plant for long periods of time, continuing to affect those pollinators and bees. So this picture I like to show people because here, yay, free seeds for bees. But then if you read the fine print, this is a neonicotinoid. So it's like you're booby trapping your bees here. You're getting your free seeds, yay, bringing the bees in, and then you end up ultimately hurting them. So be careful with your pesticides if you have to use them, would be my suggestion. And then also just be careful because I don't think that they're using neonicotinoids so much anymore in our places like Home Depot and Lowe's, but it used to be that you would see these little tags on them saying this plant is protected from problematic aphids, other pests, but really it's by neonicotinoids. So in other words, these were plants that had systemically been treated with neonicotinoids. So you just have to be careful not only about using pesticides, but also what plants you're planting and buying, making sure that you're not inadvertently harming your beneficial insects. All right, so there's all this doom and gloom. What can I do? Well, I've got some tips and good news as well. Don't worry. I never like to just bring the doom. I like to tell you what you can do as well. So one of the things that came out of some of the research that I did up in North Texas was that roadsides seem to be a really good place for bumblebee foraging. So I was doing roadside surveys where I drive along the side of the road I think I did a 24 county area of North Texas back then. I would drive around looking for patches of flowers, and then if I found some, I'd pull off safely and hop out, do a survey. And 85% of the sites that I stopped at, granted, I'm looking opportunistically for flowers, but 85% of those patches actually had at least one bumblebee individual. And so that was just my personal research that I did, but there's been other research to come out to show that roadsides do have the potential to provide good habitat for pollinators. And Texas actually does a pretty good job of maintaining our roadsides, probably starting with Ladybird Johnson, right? We have all this beautification of our roadsides with wildflowers. I was looking it up and I found out that TxDOT was given, I forget what this is, not National Pollinator something or other, but like a national award for their pollinator roadside management back in 2017. And, you know, we do a pretty good job here. However, one of the things that frustrated me so much when I was doing my surveys was that I would be driving along, flowers, 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 awesome, and then all of a sudden stuff would be mowed down. And so one of the things that I'm an advocate for is making sure that we are mowing at the right times of the year. I get it. We need to mow. We need to get that kind of that fuel for wildfire down and whatnot, but we need to mow at the right time of the year. Mow after those flowers have gone to seed. And we can increase those flowers on the side of the road. So that's what this picture is. One of those mowed areas when there should have been flowers right there. And I don't know if you know, so you can exercise your right to vote and also talking to your representatives. There's a bill which is kind of stuck in our state house right now, but it's called the Be Kind to Pollinators bill. And the idea of this is to require companies that have disrupted the roads for whatever reason, like utilities and whatnot, to come back after they've disrupted the roadsides and actually plant flowers. So basically just to mitigate what they have done and maybe even increase the habitat for pollinators. Keep that in mind, right to your legislators. Another thing that's good for bees and bumblebees in particular are urban green spaces. And this was another thing that I did a good amount of research on up in North Texas. And I'm continuing to do some work with some graduate student here in San Antonio, just on the potential for urban green spaces and bumblebees. So an urban green space I should define as open land in urban areas primarily covered with vegetation. Okay, so what is that? That's big parks and fields, community gardens, even cemeteries count as an urban green space. And the research shows that these have the potential to serve as habitat islands for bumblebees in an otherwise fragmented landscape. So otherwise we've got concrete and buildings that isn't habitable for or hospitable for bumblebees, but these little islands can help bees to persist. So one of the things that I did up in North Texas, which people just always love this because of the methods that we use. We were surveying urban green spaces, and I did not want to kill the bumblebees because I felt like I was going to be surveying so many that it didn't seem right. And probably they would have been fine if I killed them all, right? Because that's what entomologists do. We kill our insects, but I just didn't feel right about it. So I was like, how can I study these in a way that won't kill them? And I found this methodology that had been used before, shown to not affect foraging or lifespans of worker bees. And basically I would go through, and I had a number of people helping me do the surveys, but we'd collect bumblebees and then we'd kill them in a little cooler to the point where they were in effect asleep and anesthetized. And then we would take a little toe clip off of each one. And so in effect that marked them, and it also gave me a DNA sample. Then we would let them warm up in the sun and they would fly off and be happy, right? They seemed happy, at least. They went back to the flowers immediately. Oftentimes when I would repeat those sites, I would catch bumblebees right off, which had a toe missing. And so through that research and looking at all these urban green spaces, what I found was that there were lots of bees visiting these sites, lots of bumblebees visiting these sites. And when I did the genetic work, the populations were connected. So there was no evidence of barriers to admixture or just mixing of the populations because of the urban landscape. So these urban green spaces were providing really important habitat for these bumblebees. And that is just one example of research to show that type of work has been done in lots of different places. And so preserving those spaces is going to be really important for them as our cities become more and more numerous. All right, so if you want to garden for bumblebees, I definitely recommend it if you have any space at all. Here are some pictures. Oops. So I think when you are trying to design a garden, imagine a prairie with lots of different types of flowers, different colors, blooms, which are present throughout the growing season if you can. So for bumblebees, we're looking at anywhere from March all the way through October to November, and vary the shapes and colors and the types, because just like us, bumblebees are going to benefit from a diverse diet. Eating just all of one thing is not good for anybody. And then, of course, try and avoid your pesticides. Here's a picture of a prairie, just a little snippet of a prairie, I should say. And then here's an example of like a front yard, which has been totally converted into flowering plants. And you can't see it, but like this is mist flower back here, I believe. I mean, this entire yard was covered with flowers. And a lot of people ask me, well, do I have to do only natives, or shouldn't natives be the only thing I plant? And yeah, native is definitely the gold standard. It's going to be better in terms of drought tolerance and heat tolerance and whatnot. But bumblebees will go to non-native plants as well, and probably will not be a fan favorite because I'm saying that. But it's true. Bumblebees don't prefer, or bumblebees are not going to only go to our native flowers. They'll go to non-natives as well if that's easier for you to grow. But here, though, I'm going to go through some examples of plants that I really recommend for our bumblebees, and most of these are native. So redbuds starting in the beginning of the spring. This is always what makes me know that spring is right there, or right around the corner. And it'll provide early foraging habitat for your bumblebees. Salvias of all types are going to be preferred by bumblebees. Sorry, 1 second. I feel like mealy blue sage is their favorite though, and I always see bumblebees on the mealy blue sage. But lots of different types of salvia can be used. Your cenizo or Texas sage is another one. I like that one because it'll bloom kind of throughout the year, or throughout the growing season. Your Indian blanket or firewheel, Giardia, is another nice one, a nice native wildflower to plant if you can. Your Texas thistle. I used to have a picture before, like a long time ago, I used to have a musk thistle on here and I didn't realize it. It was the Elm Fork Master Naturalist that I was presenting to up in Denton County. And I remember at the end of that talk, a very nice man came up to me and he was like, great talk, this and that, but that thistle is a musk thistle. That's the bad one. And I had no idea because I'd seen bumblebees on musk thistles too, but I don't recommend the musk thistle. Do your native Texas thistle, of course. Your basket flower as well, another nice prairie flower, big blooms. Bumblebees love this one. They get into those big blooms and they're able to manipulate those pretty well and get the pollen and nectar. Your echinaceas, coneflowers. Milkweed, of course, is a great plant for your monarch butterflies, but bumblebees also like these. The antelope horn green milkweed, I've seen them on those comet milkweeds as well. I'm trying to think if I've seen them. I've not seen a bumblebee ever on that tropical milkweed. That doesn't mean they won't go to them, but I've seen them on these larger milkweed blooms a lot. Definitely a good flower. And I should pause here and say that planting all of these flowers, you're going to help your bumblebees, but you'll help lots of different pollinators by putting these in. Buttonbush, another favorite of bumblebees. Those get pretty big, as y'all probably know. Ironweed, a later summer bloomer, if I remember correctly. There's a bumblebee on the see there. And then mistflower. This is another of my just favorite pollinator plants. Bumblebees like it, but the monarchs and queen butterflies absolutely love it. Sort of schizophrenic there. I'll stop. But yeah, mistflower is a wonderful pollinator plant. Sunflowers, any type, Maximilian, common sunflowers. So really good bloom for bumblebees. And then Liatris, and Oringo, kind of spiky, but good for your pollinators. All right, so those are just some plants that you might consider, and you can find lots of plant lists online as well if you're really interested in making sure that you have a good pollinator garden. If you can't garden, or in addition to gardening, community science, also known as citizen science. Apparently, we're moving more towards the term community science because citizen science might be a little exclusive to certain groups, but community science is something you can absolutely engage in. iNaturalist is my favorite platform for that, and I'll say that the iNaturalist sightings were have been really helpful to me in trying to figure out distributions of bumblebees. So in this particular paper, I had almost 750 community science sightings, which helped me to establish the distributions of bumblebees in Texas. So your data are very important to researchers as we're tracking these populations. And basically, to be a citizen scientist or a community scientist, you take pictures of your sightings and submit them. And I assume most of y'all are on iNaturalist, so you know how to do that. Just as you see bumblebees, take pictures. Now you know the characteristics that are important for identifying them. So get a nice picture of the back of the bee and those banding patterns. We can identify them. You'll probably also know the City Nature Challenge is coming up. Just a plug for that. Get those sightings in April 30th to May 3rd. That is my favorite time of the year, the City Nature Challenge. So get your sightings in. Hopefully there'll be bumblebees around. And then one last thing, if you want to be a helper for, well, it's not me specifically. I've got 2 undergraduates who need help, and I don't know if it's been distributed to y'all yet, but I had reached out to Peter Hernandez about this, and he said that these opportunities would count towards your master naturalist hours. But I've got 2 undergraduates who need basically virtual help. One of them is needing help identifying plants on iNaturalist. She's looking at bee-plant interactions. And so if you can help her identify plants. And then another one, she's looking at honeybees, which is cool. She's more interested in honeybees, but doing counts of bees. She's applied sound to them to see if it affects foraging rates. But anyways, if you want to help count bees or help identify plants, that's something of interest to you, there's my email address. That's a shameless plug there here at the end. But yeah, just let me know if that sounds like something you'd like to do. We really appreciate your help. All right, so that is all that I have for y'all. Here's some resources if you're interested in learning more about bumblebees. And I will leave that up so y'all can write that down if you want. And I'm ready to take questions, Amanda, if there are any.
Yes, we have lots of really interesting questions. Thank you so much for that presentation and for putting up your resources slide again. I know a lot of us want to know how we can get involved and what we can do in order to protect these bumblebees. It's been great to see an interest in people wanting to plant to attract pollinators. One specific thing that I do think about is when you go to a nursery, you see plants being advertised as great for pollinators, and things are even named for pollinators, it seems like, to attract consumers' attention. And some of these plants are definitely not Texas natives, like butterfly bush or budelia, or butterfly vine. I think that might be Asian as well. So I wanted to get your feedback on non-natives, as well as non-natives that have really kind of taken over in our area, such as bastard cabbage, because you see pollinators are attracted to them. And how important is it as consumers for us to buy Texas native specifically for pollinators? And is there sort of a backlash with people buying these plants marketed for pollinators that are not native?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question and something to consider. Certainly, I mean, you'll know the native plants are better for our ecosystems as a whole, because that's how this area has evolved to include those species. In terms of, if I'm just looking at bumblebees, like I mentioned earlier, they will be on things like bastard cabbage. They will be on the musk thistles that I mentioned. I mean, they'll go to these invasives. So I would not say that like these non-native plants are negatively affecting the bumblebees. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean like, oh, it doesn't matter for bumblebees, so it doesn't matter for anything, right? Like, I think that we need to be cognizant of the fact that these can negatively affect the ecosystems as a whole. And you know, if you're planting them in your yard, you might have to water them more, which is also bad if you're like using more water because you're trying to keep them alive. So I think the trickle down effects are going to be bad, but is it going to negatively affect pollinators or bumblebees in particular? I can't say that that's the case, but the ecosystems as a whole are going to benefit more from those native plants.
Sure.
And I, like I said, I think I said earlier, I'm really bad with plants, and that is not my area of expertise, but just as an ecologist in general, that is what I would say is like, you know, try to steer clear of those non-natives, especially the ones that are invasive.
Right. I was surprised to see on one of your slides a big bumblebee on like a trumpet-shaped flower, because I associate trumpet-shaped flowers with, you know, hummingbirds. But that was a big flower, and that bumblebee was digging right in there. So that really opened my mind, because I didn't think that they would go for things like that. And also, you mentioned, because people ask, are there certain colors or shapes that bumblebees or bees are attracted to, as, you know, as pollinators, as opposed to hummingbirds, say, or other pollinators? And you did mention that variety, just like for us, is really important for them as well. So that was really interesting for me. You know, so perhaps we can tell people, well, actually, it's not about one or two colors or one or two shapes, you know. So that was cool. Another question people have is about some of these chemicals that are used as insecticides. And as most of us know, pyrethrin is made from chrysanthemums, and it's touted as a natural insecticide, I guess you could say. But it does not distinguish between a bumblebee and, you know, an aphid, for example. I mean, it's going to affect all insects. Doesn't matter if they're, you know, pollinators or the good insects or what have you. So I do think that's important to keep in mind, because I've also noticed products being touted as not affecting pollinators that are insecticides. And so I think that's a tricky one we need to pay attention to as well. And one question in particular about pyrethrin, chrysanthemums, which the chemical is made from, are chrysanthemums at all toxic to bumblebees on their own? I've wondered about that myself, but of course, people put out a lot of mums in October and that season. And I know you mentioned plants aren't your specialty, but I think it's just
Right.
an interesting question.
I can't speak to chrysanthemums. I'm not sure about that, but now I'm like, I feel like I need to write it down and go look because that's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
I will say that they're like the trees that are the linden trees, I believe it might be a family or a genus, I can't remember, but the linden ones tend to be more toxic to bumblebees. So there are certain plants that have those, chemicals in them that are naturally occurring that can be bad for bees. I don't know about the chrysanthemums though, so I'll have to look that up to see.
Right. Okay. Yeah, something that I've wondered about as well. Some other questions. Folks are wondering, do bumblebees rest or even sleep on flowers, or do they make it back to their hive at night?
Yes, that's a fun question. So yes, they do. So they don't sleep like we do per se, but they do have sort of dormant periods of the day that are kind of analogous to sleep. And sometimes they don't make it back to the hive at night. And so you'll find them out on flowers and, that's lucky. Just leave them alone. They're just chilling and they will find their way back to where they need to go eventually. But yes, absolutely. They quote unquote sleep and, I mean, ideally they'd make it back home, but we also, sometimes we don't make it back home. We have to sleep on someone's couch.
True.
So,
yeah, I've seen that before. Somebody sent me a picture of that. And of course, at first I thought, oh no, it died on the flower, but yeah, it was taking a little nap.
they're just sleeping. Didn't make it home.
Right. Some other questions that we have here. It's great to have this slide with your resources on it. It's difficult, I think we all tend to Google things, and having appropriate resources for answers to our questions is so important because, anything can come up on Google. Even doing a search of Texas native plants for bumblebees, you'll find all kinds of non-natives on that answer. And that's according to Google's algorithm, Yeah. So I think it's great that we have some websites here, and I wanted to maybe publicize a couple more that I think are pretty trustworthy. Like the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. I believe their website is just wildflower.org. And perhaps even our local Native Plant Society of Texas might have a list of appropriate Texas natives, of course, for attracting all kinds of pollinators, but bumblebees as well, of course. So I want to thank you for putting that up and for keeping that up.
Yeah, I was going to say this middle one, it has some really good plant lists on it from TPWD. So if you're looking for plant list, if you go to this one, you might have to click a little bit from that homepage, but yeah, that one has a good plant list.
Sure. Okay. Right. That's great. Somebody was saying that they believe that they're seeing bumblebees this spring in their garden, particularly around like water sources, but that they might be actually something else instead. And they were asking about like body shape, of like yellow jackets or other wasps like that, as compared to bumblebees. I think you gave us some great slides of the bumblebees and how round they are, and all their qualities, like the fuzziness all over their bodies and things like that. So I appreciate you doing that as well. About the proposed legislation that you mentioned, do you know in particular, is that legislation going to list specific Texas natives to be planted in our ecoregions, or is it going to be more broadly defined just as, pollinator plants? I guess, again, that gets back to that Texas native question versus, just general pollinator plants.
Yeah, that's so if I remember correctly, because I pulled it up and it's just a one-page document at this point. I'm sure they'll and like I said, it's stuck in the House right now, so it's not actually moving forward at this point.
Right.
I'm sure they'll amend it all, but right now, if I remember correctly, I think it just said pollinator plants, but I'd have to go back and look it up. But that would be something to, make sure, write in about and voice that, especially y'all as master naturalists, and you've got that expertise in knowing native plants versus just pollinator plants. Like the more we can have people who have a scientific background actually influencing the science policy, it'll be great. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So more to learn on that as it develops, but it's very exciting that it.
Yes. Yeah. Just that they're even thinking about it. I'm like, awesome. There's something about pollinators and legislation. Great. She froze on Amanda, you froze on my end. There's more questions. There you are.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. My internet is going in and out, but I just want to say thank you so much. We've all really, really learned a lot, and we really appreciate learning about the bees and learning what we can do to take steps to help them in Texas and all over.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. I wish I could interact with y'all more, honestly. Like I wish I could see y'all's faces and talk with y'all. But it's been nice to just get to share this with y'all.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Gary.
Oh, you're welcome anytime.
Again.
I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you all for
Okay.
coming. Thank you all. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Adios, everybody.